this week in our final session in our August Bible study series, Rare Birds, as we've been looking at some of the smaller, shorter, lesser-known minor prophets. We're going to travel back to the early 6th century BC. But before we do, I want to ask us to take a brief detour to more recent memory, to just like 2020, 2021, when we were dealing with the worst of the COVID pandemic. I want to ask you to remember, if you can, what it was like. You probably have recollections of how everything in our lives changed, how very quickly our old routines got broken, and when buildings were closed and public gatherings were limited and schools were closed and the world just sort of shut down for a while. Initially, just sort of everybody hunkering down at home, and then with learning on screens for students in schools and limits at how many people could be in the grocery store at a time and public social distancing, all of our routines changed dramatically. Church gatherings dramatically changed. Public gatherings, all of that stopped, came to a halt. And as we lived through it, a lot of us were left asking questions like, where's God in all of this? And how comfortable are we supposed to get with this new arrangement? Is this forever, or is this going to be for a short time? We found our ordinary lives and routines upended. And while we lived through that, at some point it became clear, okay, life would get back to normal. And when that happened, when doors reopened, when kids started going back to school in modified forms at first, we all sort of slowly got back into the groove of life. We slowly got back into, here's how I go grocery shopping again, and here's how my job works now that I can go back to my place of business, and figuring out the balance, right, between what things we did on screens and what things we did in person with people. We slowly came back to that, although probably all of us who lived through COVID still have marks somehow in our memories and in our minds of how things were different and how we remember things were, and even how we do things now moving forward into the post-COVID era. The thing that sticks in my memory right now is how easy it was after COVID for us to move on with a new normal that just didn't make the time for gathering with other people. Even today, my kids are much more used to getting takeout and eating at home than they would be comfortable eating in a restaurant. I know lots of other kids who lived through COVID who are like, why would I go out somewhere when I could just watch a movie at home or watch a TV show? Why would I actually go into a big public place? In important formative years for them, they lost that, and they've been marked by it. For a number of us who were part of church life, we noticed too how getting back into the routine of normal, how easy it was once people were out of the habit of gathering in person in worship with people, just for it not to come back at all. I mean, sure, we could watch things on screens. Yeah, we could talk to the people we knew from church via email or phone calls, but how hard it was for a lot of us to get back into the actual routine of gathering in worship, of making the priority, of setting aside the time, of being in the same room with other people to worship God, to hear from God's word, to celebrate at the Lord's table. Once you get out of a good habit, even if you don't even deny it was a good habit, it's really, really hard to start back up again. Well, if you can remember all of that experience, what it was like to go through the jarring difficulty of COVID, and then the difficulty of rebuilding a new normal, and how you decided what became a part of your new normal again. Was public worship, was gathering with God's people important, or did that fall by the wayside? Then you're actually in a pretty good spot to understand what's going on in the book of Haggai, which is one of those small, short books of the minor prophets toward the end of our Old Testament, the end of the collection we call the Hebrew Bible. I gotta admit to you, as we were preparing for this week's session, I was sort of getting myself ready to just feel like we were going through the motions. Oh, here's one more prophet who yells about bad things and complains that people aren't being godly and announces judgment or whatever, and found myself surprised at how relatable Haggai was in ways I wasn't expecting, because Haggai lives with the situation of people who had gone through the exile, right? They'd seen everything thrown up into the air as those people first went into exile. They lost their temple, right? The Babylonians came and burned it to the ground and took away their king and ended their independent nation status and carried many people literally away back into Babylon, where those people then grew up and got used to life in Babylon, and they they had kids and they raised their kids, and some of them even, retired and got old and gray and died in Babylon. 70 years they were in exile. And while they held on to the memories and the stories of being God's people, and maybe they held on to the stories and the scriptures and the poems that were part of their formative faith, they didn't have that central common place to gather. The temple was this hugely important institution for ancient Israel and Judah. It's where you went and you offered sacrifices. It was sort of this place where we knew God came near to us. That was sort of the thinking, right? And to have lost that, when the people finally do come back from exile, their first interest is, okay, we got to find out how to survive, right? People coming back from exile, we're building a new normal again, right? Starting farms again, starting lives again, coming back to their old ancestral homes and trying to pick up where things had left off 70 years before. And survival was the first goal. Okay, fine. But as they started building their lives again, it was real easy for new habits to start up again and not to care about God or gathering with God's people. And Haggai's one of those voices who's like, this is not good. The new normal can't leave God out. This is a moment for us to build good new routines, good new habits. Let's center God in that. And so Haggai is really, really, really excited and eager and beating the drum for, we need to rebuild the temple. And at first, I gotta be honest, rereading Haggai for our study this week, there was a piece of me that thought, oh, Haggai, I want to root for you, but don't you know that God isn't stuck in a building somewhere, that God doesn't need a temple? And I think, if I'm honest, Haggai knows that the temple doesn't need to be built because God needs a building to live in, but the temple needs to be built because the people need this sense of a common place to gather so that God can be part of the new normal, of the routine, of the rhythm of their lives, so that as they come back from exile, they don't just sort of move on ahead and say, we don't really need to gather with other people and worship God. We can just do it on our own. Or maybe we don't even need to worship God at all. We'll just make more money, keep being busy, doing our jobs and working in our lives. And we just can leave God behind. Haggai is one of those voices that says, don't leave God behind. This is a moment where we are starting over again. Let's start over well and build the temple and make the priority of gathering together with God's people. And the more I think about it, the more I think he's on to something. There's something really, really important about us making the priority, taking the time and making the effort of gathering and being centered with God's people. Not because God needs to live in a building that we've built, but because we need, in time and space, to give that priority to God. That changes everything. If you've ever had that experience of missing a Sunday of worship and feeling like your whole week was sort of off because it just didn't feel like things were quite right, like the gears weren't catching, that's what Haggai sort of calls us back to make the priority, not because God needs it, but because we do, and God knows it. So join us for a conversation this coming Thursday as we have our last session looking at these minor prophets and take a look at the book of Haggai. And even though you and I aren't in the quest of building a temple, we are always being asked what things are important enough to make the center of our routines and the weekly patterns of our lives. And there, Haggai has a lot to offer us. So join us then for this final session of Rare Birds. See you then.